Welcome back to Traveling Dice. I'm Jason. I recently got together with a good friend in my gaming group who we hadn't played Warhammer in a few months, and we decided to get in a big game. So we did a 4,000 point game, Wood Elves versus Warriors of Chaos. When we decided to play, we rolled up a scenario from the rule book at random, and we happened to get Dawn Attack. So this is an interesting scenario where you don't have full control over your deployment. The fluff of the story is, I don't know, your army's drunk or they partied too much or something along those lines, and they're not quite showing up to the battle as intended. So for every unit in your army, you're rolling a d6. On the roll of a 1, they have to be placed on the left flank. On a roll of a 2, they have to be placed on the right flank. And then on a 3 through 5, they're placed in the center. On a 6, you get to choose. Now, in all fairness, I don't think that the slight randomness to the deployment had a huge effect on the game. And I think that's in part due to the armies that we were playing. We didn't have armies that were really weak on leadership. I could see the scenario being more worrisome if you're an orc and goblin player, or if you're lacking mobility, like maybe a dwarf army or something of that nature. But we both had armies that were fairly maneuverable and weren't too terribly worried about leadership. So it's interesting. The other interesting element about the scenario is one player does deploy their entire army first. I always find that kind of an interesting swing when scenarios have that. There's a few scenarios in the book where that is the case. And then usually that player gets the first turn on a roll, or at least gets to choose. On a roll of a 6, the second player gets to decide if they're going to go first or second. So I ended up being the one who deployed first. My opponent ended up being the one that deployed second. Now, fortunately, I did get that first turn. Let's take a look at my opponent's army, and this is going from my perspective. The perspective is the left flank from my viewpoint. On the extreme left flank, my opponent has a big, beefy block of 25 Chaos Warriors. They have full command, shields, and the Gleaming Pennant, which is going to allow them to re-roll the first failed leadership check. Next to those warriors, my opponent has a block of 20 Chosen of Chaos. They have full command. They're armed with a great weapon, a Mark of Corn. And these guys roll on the Eye of the Gods table at the beginning of the game, and they get +1 toughness. So they're toughness 5. Man, this is kind of a scary unit, and I was a little worried about it, but yeah, they're going to bring the pain here during this battle for sure. Behind the Chosen, my opponent has 3 Skull Crushers with lances. Next to the Chosen, my opponent has his BSB, which is an exalted hero. It's on a barded demonic mount. He has a Mark of Tzeentch, a shield, Third Eye of Tzeentch, and the Talisman of Preservation. This guy is very difficult to kill, so he ends up with a 3-up ward save, re-rolling 1s. He doesn't pack a huge punch. He's only strength 5. And I say only, I mean, strength 5 is respectable, but you can get these guys easily up to strength 6 if you forego some of the defenses. So he went the more defensive route, sacrificing just a little bit of that punch. But this guy's going to be a real pair to bring down during the course of this battle. And next to the BSB, my opponent has a Chaos Chariot. Working my way over to my opponent's center, he has 6 trolls. Behind the trolls, he has a Chimera and a War Shrine. Next to the trolls, we have a unit of 6 knights. This is going to also be the place where his lord ends up. His general is a Chaos Lord. He has the Mark of Tzeentch. He has a Flaming Breath. He has Soul Feeder, Charm Shield, Hellfire Sword, Talisman of Endurance, and a Barded Chaos Steed. So similar in some respects to his BSB. This guy's going to be hard to kill. He's got a 1-up armor save, and he ends up with a 4-up ward save. The Soul Feeder potentially allows him to regain wounds as he's doing wounds in combat, which he's very likely to be doing. For every wound that he does, he's going to be regaining 1 on the roll of a 6. The Hellfire Sword doesn't give him any boost to strength, so he's going to be at strength 5. However, it does give him flaming attacks, which as a Wood Elf army with the Treemen and the Treekin, there's plenty of good targets for that flaming attack. And it also gives him D3 wounds, which is, again, very good against those things. So it's interesting. It's an interesting item. You roll a D6 every turn, and on the roll of a 1, it does a damage to the bearer. So you can kind of cross your fingers there. It's something that's sometimes hard to remember to roll, but it's an interesting little tidbit on there. But like the BSB, this guy's also going to be rather difficult to kill. Behind the knights, my opponent has a bunker for his level 2 sorcerer. So this is a bunker. It's 10 chaos warriors with shields, full command. And the wizard in there is a chaos sorcerer. He's level 2. He's got the dispel scroll, and he's on the lore of fire. Looking closer here towards the right flank, we have 2 units of warhounds on the left side of the building. On the right side of the building, an additional unit of warhounds. Behind the building, we have a unit of 20 marauders, full command with great weapons. There's also a level 4 wizard, a chaos sorcerer. He is on Mark of Tzeentch. He has the enchanted shield. Opal amulet, which is going to give him a 4 board save versus, I believe, the first wound suffered. He has Chaos Familiar, which I think gives him an extra spell. Iron Curse icon, and he's on the lore of Tzeentch. He's got most of the goodies, and Gateway is going to be among them. And last but definitely not least, my opponent has tucked over there on the extreme right flank, hiding out from some of my firepower, is a Shaggoth with a great weapon. So we'll see. Hopefully we'll bring this guy down. All right, we'll take a look at my forces here, starting at the same flank here. So this is opposite that big block of Chaos Warriors. I have a Great Eagle. I have a unit of Dryads, 24 strong with the champion. Inside the forest next to the Dryads, I have several Treemen, and I have a unit of Archers. For the first time here, I'm trying out some of the fancy arrow options that the Wood Elves have access to in 8th edition. So that particular unit is armed with the Arcane Bumpkins, which is going to give a -3 armor save. So hopefully I'm able to capitalize on that, because definitely some of my opponent's stuff is heavily armored. In that forest, we have a total of 3 Treemen, 2 on the right-hand side from my perspective of the Archers, 1 on the left. Behind the Archers, and this is largely due to the deployment restraints of the scenario, this unit had to deploy in the center, so I normally wouldn't deploy it in such a manner, but I have a second unit of Dryads, and this particular unit, in addition to having the unit champion, also has a Branch Wraith. The Branch Wraith is a level 1 on the Lore of Life. She ended up rolling Throne of Vines, which I was hoping to get on my level 4. So I took the signature spell. Not ideal. I was really hoping I could take one of the spells that I didn't really critically want on my level 4, which really was just that one and Dwellers. Any other spell I would have taken, which would have given me a little bit more versatility on the spell selection on my level 4, which unfortunately ends up coming into play. Taking a look at the center of my force, I have a unit of 5 Wild Riders. They have a Banner of Swiftness, so it brings them up to movement 10. They have a champion, they're armed with shields, and they also have the Standard Bearer, of course. So I'm really interested. I haven't fielded these guys before. I'm interested to see what they can do. They bring a lot of strength 5 attacks. They're super fast. Yeah, it should be interesting here. Behind those guys, I have my Treeman Ancient, who is my level 4. So real big bummer here when I go to roll my spells. I get Dwellers, which is great. Dwellers is a really powerful, versatile spell. My opponent doesn't have a low strength army, so it does limit its effectiveness, and he also doesn't have a ton of big units. I mean, sure, the Chosen is a pretty big block, especially for how many points per model they are. The 25 block of Chaos Warriors is also a big block for how many points per model they are. But he doesn't have any of these gigantic units that are really going to be scared of Dwellers. So, it's okay. It's not ideal. The spell that I really wanted, that I thought was going to be really, really critical in this battle, was the +2 toughness augment. And I didn't get that. I didn't get any doubles, so I didn't have the opportunity to swap any spells out. Yeah, so I had a level 4, rolled 4 dice. I didn't get any doubles, and I also didn't get Throne of Vines. So the spells that I got were probably the worst possible outcome here. I do have Dwellers, so my opponent does have to respect that, but the +2 toughness would have been really helpful in some of the situations my army finds itself in. The Treeman Ancient is my general. I think he's just slightly more survivable than the Elf Lord that I do also have. You could go either way on it. The Treeman Ancient is going to have the ability to heal himself with throwing the life magic, which he might have the opportunity to heal the Elf Lord as well. But obviously the Wizard's always going to be within 12 inches of itself. So that wasn't really something that I was too terribly concerned about. You could go either way on it, but they have the same leadership. They're both leadership 10. I went ahead and made the Tree Man Ancient my general. Next to the Wild Riders, I do have a Glade Lord on Forest Dragon. I gave him the Helm of the Hunt, Sword of Anti-Heroes, and the Enchanted Shield, Talisman of Protection. So the 4-up ward save. He is potentially really, really good, especially the opportunity to go up against units with lots of characters in there with the Sword of Anti-Heroes. I really like the Sword of Anti-Heroes in theory. It looks great on paper. Every time I've tried to kind of roll it out in an actual battle situation, it hasn't worked out. My opponent's army doesn't have multiple characters in the same unit. Now, maybe he audibled because he knew I had the Sword of Anti-Heroes. Maybe he was going to pile a bunch of these guys in the same units. I'm kind of skeptical of that. I think the Lord on the Chaos Steed was always going to go in with the Knights. The BSB is not afraid of much. He's probably always running around on his own. And the bunkers are for the Wizards. So, yeah, in best case scenario, my guy's going to get +1 attack, +1 strength. For 30 points, it's not terrible, but there are other good options. And in retrospect, if I knew what I was up against, it probably wouldn't be my first choice in terms of magical weapon. Also, I failed to take the Dragonbane Helm. Helm of the Hunt is good. It gives you +1 to your armor save. It gives you devastating charge, so you get an extra attack. So my thought with this guy in terms of the design was like, he's going to bring a lot of attacks, potentially at really high strength if I'm going up against a unit that has a lot of characters. And that was the thought behind him. It's not going to work perfectly because my opponent's not really set up like that. And the Dragonbane Helm would have been a lot better because it would have given me a 2-up ward save against Flaming, which my opponent's big fire sword is a threat to really all my guys. And even though my opponent didn't take something that would give him more strength 5 gets it done against the Elves. So it is something that I definitely have to factor in. I'm also curious how the Forest Dragon's going to do. He does have I believe it's a strength 2 breath weapon. I'm going from memory here. But it is, I think, -3 armor. Behind the Dragon and the Tree Man Ancient, I do have a block of 7 Treekin with a champion. Now working the way over to my right flank, behind the hill, I have a Great Eagle. I've got 3 units of archers on this side, and they got a little piled up due to the deployment here. So we're kind of on a tight table for 4,000 points. This is a 5-foot by 5-foot table. So I've got 3 units of archers over here on this side. One of them has the Arcane Bumpkins, -3 armor save. One of them has Moonfire shots, and one of them has Starfire shots, which is flaming attacks, +1 to wound. 1 unit's on the Forces of Order, 1 unit's on the Forces of Destruction. So even the Forces of Order one's still going to get the flaming attacks, which will be helpful against the Trolls, be helpful against the Chimera. And then I have 1 more Great Eagle on that far flank. So I do end up getting the first turn, fortunately, here. I do a cautious advance. I move up with the Dryads. I move up with the Wild Riders, the Treemen, the Tree Man Ancient, the Dragon advances. And this is a really conservative advance, probably something like 3 or 4 inches. I'm hoping that my opponent advances, and then I kind of get the opportunity to decide on the charges that I want to do. I do have on that right flank also a couple of heroes. I have a level 2 on the Lore of Shadow. I was really hoping to get the hexes that reduce strength. There's one that reduces strength by D3. There's one that reduces toughness by D3. I didn't end up getting either of those spells. Mind Razor also would have been a great option, especially with all the armor that I'm up against. So really there were 3 spells that I thought would be super useful. I only have a level 2. I didn't roll doubles. I didn't roll any of those spells. So the shadow magic that I end up with is not as useful as I was hoping it might be. My shooty hero does have the Hail of Doom arrow, which is going to come into play. The hero's unit with the Hail of Doom arrow and the Moonfire shots fires at the Knights, and I do use the Hail of Doom arrow. So I'm ideally hopefully killing a couple Knights here. I managed to only take out 1. Doesn't even force that panic check, but again, he's got the Lore's leadership, he's got the BSB nearby, so trying to break these guys in combat, trying to get them to panic, these are great ways of dealing with these guys that are super hard to kill, but at least I got 1 Knight down with that first section of shooting. My other archers started to open up a little bit on the Trolls. I was able to use some of the flaming shots to knock out the regen. I ended up doing 5 wounds on the Trolls. So an okay start to the shooting. I was hoping to soften my opponent up a little bit more during that first turn. Not really surprising, my opponent does a pretty aggressive move forward on his turn. So although he's got a lot of infantry, his stuff is moving up at a pretty steady clip. Not necessarily full pace on like the Chimera and maybe the Knights, but definitely the infantry is flying up there. The Shaggoth is flying up that flank. I forget what movement he is, but he's surprisingly fast. We go over to the opponent's magic phase, and he rolls a 5 and a 4, no channels. So he's got 9 power dice to my 5 dispel dice. He starts out with Bolt of Change. He's targeting the Lord on Dragon. He throws 3 dice. I opt out to let that spell through, knowing my opponent's sitting on Gateway. He's sitting on Fireball. These are things that seem like they're a bigger risk. And I do luck out. My opponent doesn't actually do any damage with that. So I believe that's the spell that kind of works like a bolt thrower. And he fails to wound, which is awesome. He jumps over to Gateway. Okay, so now I'm kind of getting my dispel dice ready here. And he rolls 4 dice. He gets a 13 total. It's a really pitiful roll with 4 dice because he's adding his wizard levels to that as well with the level 4. And he fails to cast it, which is a huge relief. This is pretty much going to be the end of his magic phase. His remaining dice he throws at Fireball, but I'm able to dispel that one. My Lord on Dragon declares a charge on one of the units of Warhounds, which flees. I elect to redirect on another unit of Warhounds, which also flees. I guess this is what dirt cheap troops are intended to do here. So my dragon ends up just kind of stumbling forward a little bit. The trolls have been softened up a little bit, so I decided to send in a block of Dryads and a Tree Man to help them out. My Great Eagle on the right flank charges the last unit of Warhounds. These brave Warhounds actually decide to hold, so it should be an interesting little bout there to see which unit can hold out. I'm hopeful my Eagle can pull it out. My Eagle on my left flank is kind of trying to bait these big block of Chaos Warriors. It's a charge that would require him to roll a 9 on the dice, so my hope is that he ends up declaring that charge and comes up short. This allows me to preserve the Eagle and continue to use it as some chaff, but also delay the arrival of that block. They are standing near a Cauldron of Blood, so they are frenzied. So they do have the Gleaming Pendant, so if they fail the leadership check, they will have to charge, but they have to fail it twice. My other treemen move up in a position to support, hopefully in the subsequent rounds as needed, and this is true for the Wild Riders and the Treekin as well. On my right flank, I got to do something about this Shaggoth who's arriving a little faster than anticipated, so I'm willing to sacrifice an Eagle to slow down his arrival. Bounce over to my magic phase. I end up rolling a 5 and a 3 for the Winds of Magic. Both myself and my opponent channel. And I start off with 3 dice on Shield of Thorns, targeting the Tree Man who is in combat with the Trolls. This is a Remains in Play spell. It's going to cause 2d6 strength 3 hits at the end of every magic phase until it's dispelled. My opponent elects to let that spell through. With my second spell, I target the Chosen with Dwellers Below, and I'm rolling 6 dice at this bad boy. I get just a massive roll, 24 on the dice, plus 4 for my level 4, 28 total. On 6 dice, you can average about 21, so I'm definitely ahead of the average here. And my opponent has a bit of a decision here. He is sitting on 6 dispel dice, so he can definitely throw those dice. He can hope to get lucky and get a big number, or maybe even more likely double 6s and just stop it outright. Or he can use his dispel scroll. But this is kind of a waste of his dice, I think, is what his thoughts were as he's making this decision. And he elects to throw the dice at dispelling this. Now he fails, which is great. So I'm going to start to soften up this Chosen unit a little bit. And I end up killing 6 of these Chosen with the Dwellers Below. Going over to the combat with the Warhounds against the Great Eagle. The Great Eagle does 1 wound. I have the charge. I'm up by 2. Should break this unit. I think their leadership 5 needing a 3, and he rolls the 3. Just brutal that those guys are hanging around. I'm still in a decent spot though. I haven't taken any damage yet, and hopefully beat them in subsequent rounds. In the combat between the Dryads, the Tree Man Ancient, and the Chaos Trolls, I managed to kill 2 Trolls, which is just great. I've got a lot of static combat resolution. I've got a charge. I've got 3 ranks. I do take a few wounds on the Dryads, and I managed to break the Trolls. Unfortunately, they get away, so neither unit actually catches them. As I am attempting to catch them, the Tree Man Ancient goes into the Chimera, and the Dryads end up charging my opponent's BSB. The Dryads are going to be in a real tough spot. They're going to get counter-charged by a bunch of stuff, but I've managed to gum up the middle of the battlefield here, and I don't mind the Tree Man Ancient's odds against the Chimera. The Dryads engaged with my opponent's BSB end up being countercharged by not only the Chosen, but also the Skull Crushers. So this is going to be one of those situations where you're just like, okay, I'll take my unit off now. Of course, we go through and roll the dice, but that unit is in a really bad spot. The Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, of course, charges the Great Eagle. The block of Chaos Warriors on my left flank end up failing that charge against the Great Eagle there, which is just great. It's going to tie them up for multiple rounds. And yeah, really happy with that outcome. My opponent's unit of Chaos Knights ends up tucked in behind the Chimera there. They didn't have a ton of maneuverable options, but as soon as that combat is cleared, either by the Chimera losing or winning, he is in a great position to wreak havoc. This takes us over to the magic phase. My opponent rolls a Winds of Magic, a 5 and a 4. This kind of result, when it's your turn, is just great. This is exactly what you want. You're going to have a lot more dice than your opponent. Right, the worst outcome really is like well, not necessarily the worst, but a bad outcome is like a 6 and a 1. You can have a very similar number to your opponent, or maybe even the same if they channel and you don't. So my opponent has 9 power dice to my 5 dispel dice. We both end up channeling, so that gives 10 to 6. So this is an area where I started thinking, okay, this might be the round where I'm going to use my scroll. But my opponent starts out with the Bound spell on the War Shrine, and he rolls Snake Eyes. Okay, like a great start here that doesn't go off, and he's expended 2 of his dice, so now I'm feeling a little bit better. With his second spell, my opponent chooses to cast the Bolt of Change. He uses 2 dice, and I end up dispelling that by throwing 2 dice. We both hit a total of 8. My opponent tries a 2-die fireball, which I let go. He's targeting my archers. He gets 1 hit and 1 wound, which is the only wound of this particular magic phase. And with my opponent's last 5 dice, he's throwing Gateway at my Lord on Dragon. He gets a total of 21, and I elect to use my scroll. The Dragon Ogre Shaggoth just murders my Great Eagle as expected and reforms. In that prolonged combat between my Great Eagle and these Warhounds, we each do 1 wound. It's a push. Just comical here. This Great Eagle, I think, should be outperforming these Warhounds, but they're just hanging in there. As expected, tree parts go flying everywhere as the Dryads are just massacred by the Chosen, the Skull Crushers, and my opponent's BSB. That unit is broken and run down, and the middle here is completely gummed up. Jumping over to the combat with the Tree Man Ancient against the Chimera. We both roll really poorly, and no damage is done. The Chimera is going to end up reforming so that I'm no longer benefiting from a flank. In this particular combat with the Tree Man Ancient and the Chimera, I do elect to use the Tree Man Ancient's Tree Whack attack. So instead of using my normal attacks, I only get the 1 attack, and instead of rolling to hit, my opponent takes an initiative test. If it's failed, and this can only be on 1 model, if it's failed, my opponent takes D6 wounds with no armor saves. Still going to get his regen. The Chimera does have the regen, but this is, I thought, going to be more effective than just trying to attack him. It's kind of an all or nothing approach, so it's potentially a way just to bring down the Chimera in kind of 1 round of combat, but it's real swingy. You're counting on him failing the initiative test, which he's going to do most of the time. The Chimera is only initiative 2, and then you're counting on rolling decently on the number of wounds, which is going to be a D6, and then the regen saves, of course. So there's a lot of randomness to this particular strategy, which is all right. But in this particular round, I ended up doing no damage, taking no damage. Going into the top of round 3 here now, I have an opportunity to do some counter charges myself, and those Chosen are looking pretty vulnerable. I'm able to flank them with my Tree Man Ancient, a regular Tree Man, and then do a rear charge with a unit of Dryads. Now, the Dryads, I'm kind of worried they're going to take a lot of casualties, but I'm also thinking they have the potential of really supplying a lot of static combat resolution. I should get the rear, unless somehow he manages to kill the entire unit, which is going to be +2. Any ranks that I have will also add to that. And then the Chosen, I think, are particularly vulnerable to the Thunderstorms from the Tree Man and the Tree Man Ancient. On the left-hand flank, I set up the Great Eagle in pretty much exactly the same fashion as before. I'm trying to bait my opponent here into charging, So I think a slightly shorter charge than I gave him the first time. But he probably won't do this voluntarily. However, if he fails that leadership check, because he is by the Cauldron of Blood, he will have no option but to charge. And again, just tying up that unit with a dirt cheap Great Eagle is great at this point. I end up repositioning a few of my archer units as well as my wild riders, trying to anticipate what's going to be busting through and what I need to countercharge with them. And again, trying to line up some shots. A lot of things that I want to shoot at are in combat or are difficult to see at this point. Going over to my magic phase, I this time roll a 5 and a 4 for the Winds of Magic, and I channel. So I've got a ton of dice, and I've got the upper hand in this particular magic phase thanks to the Winds of Magic. I kick it off with 2 dice at regen spell 5+ on the Dryad unit that is in the rear of the Chosen. And my opponent throws 2 dispel dice at this and manages to dispel it. And at that point, I immediately am going for a 6-die Dwellers, which my opponent uses his dispel scroll on. And then I round out this magic phase with Awakening of the Woods, 1 die. I get it off, but I do no damage to the War Shrine. I finally end up breaking this pesky unit of Warhounds here, not without taking another wound, though, on my Great Eagle. I do 2 wounds to the unit and break it, and I elect not to pursue, hoping to use the Eagle in future redirects in that area. So I failed to mention, but I did charge the Elf Lord on Force Dragon into the unit of Knights containing my opponent's general, his Lord. Now, the Knights aren't actually going to be too terribly important in this combat because they're going to end up in a challenge. My opponent has to challenge, and I'm going to be in a position where I have to accept. And I'm really hoping here just to kind of dodge the bullet. It's a little swingy. This is a little dicey. I knew I took a risk. I knew there was a chance that my Elf Lord just gets killed. But I decided to go for it. That the upside of this maneuver, I felt like outweighed the downside. Even if my Elf Lord gets killed, I still got the dragon potentially there. The dragon is going to be a little harder for my opponent to take down than the Elf Lord. So I went for it. I kind of pushed all the chips in. My Elf Lord does indeed get killed, and I really fail to do much to my opponent's Lord here, and the dragon ends up breaking. Fortunately, he gets away, so the dragon's not lost. He'll need to rally on a subsequent turn, but hopefully factor into the battle a little bit more in the turns to come. My opponent rolls quite poorly on his pursuit roll and ends up right in front of a unit of Treekin. In the combat between the Tree Man and the Chimera, I managed to do a wound to the Chimera while taking 3, so not ideal. I am stubborn, so that fight's going to continue here, but I would have loved to have damaged that Chimera a little bit more. The Chimeras are really scary, but they only have 4 wounds, so doing a couple wounds to it is kind of a big deal. My opponent's Chosen kills 6 of my Dryads, and they put a wound on the Treeman Ancient. In turn, I managed to kill 6 of the Chosen. I win this combat by a little bit, but my opponent has his BSB and General nearby, and they hold. At least they're not going to be frenzied anymore. I had also managed to get a flank charge off with that 3rd Treeman on my opponent's Chaos Chariot, which is nice, especially considering the positioning. Even if this turns into a prolonged combat, which it does, it kind of pins down those Skull Crushers, which are a big threat. I end up doing a couple wounds on the Chariot, and I take a wound, and the Chariot holds. In the bottom of turn 3, my opponent's BSB, who found himself just in the middle of the battlefield watching chaos erupt around him, decides it's time for him to get into the fray here, and he's going to help his buddy out, the Chimera. He charges the Tree Man fighting the Chimera in the flank. As expected, my opponent's Knights with his Chaos Lord charge my Treekin, and that Hellfire Sword is just made for Treekin, so I'm not too terribly excited about this bout here, but there were really no other options. And sadly, the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth has discovered the gooey center of the elf army and charges one of my archer units. That last remaining Warhound continues to flee. He actually needs Snake Eyes to rally anyway, so he is not going to come into factor here the remainder of the game. The Marauders with the Chaos Sorcerer decide to pop out of that building, I think just to get in range of some of the targets that they're eyeing for the magic phase. My opponent starts off with Bolt of Change using 2 dice, targeting the dragon. I decide to let this through, and my opponent fails to wound, so off to a pretty good start here. My opponent then elects to target the Wild Riders with Fireball. He throws 2 dice on this, and again, I let it through, thinking I'm going to have to try to stop Gateway here, and he kills 2 Wild Riders. My opponent ends up getting Irresistible Force for that Gateway, so I have no option. He targets my dragon and does 3 wounds. And then he fails to cast the Pink Fire and also fails to cast the Bound spell for the War Shrine. The Kaboom from the miscast table ends up just killing a couple of Marauders. This round, no damage is done between the Treeman and the Chaos Chariot, and that fight continues. We actually go back and we remember, I got to take a terror test when that Shaggoth is charging me, and of course I failed that, so my archers are just off running around, and the Shaggoth goes forward. The Treeman ends up getting killed while fighting the BSB and the Chimera. I do get a round of attacks, and I do 2 more wounds on the Chimera, so that thing's walking around with just 1 more wound left, which is, kind of frustrating and exciting at the same time. I would have loved to have gotten that last wound off on him, but at least my opponent has to think about what he's doing here. I get really lucky here in the combat between the Treekin and the Chaos Knights with the Chaos Lord. My opponent really, his dice cool off here in this particular combat, and he is struggling to hit and to wound. It is fair. I'm toughness 5. And then I do have a ward save against like the Knights and stuff like that, but it's only a 6-up ward. Regardless, he's only doing a few wounds here, and I'm going to end up being steadfast. I'm only strength 4, so it's a big ask of expecting these guys to do much damage here. But they do hang around, which is great. Both our dice go pretty cold in this particular combat between the Chosen, the Dryads, the Treeman, and the Treeman Ancient. However, I do win the combat and break the Chosen and run them down. So the Dryads and the Treeman and the Treeman Ancient all move forward in pursuit. At the top of my turn 4, I like to charge the Dryad unit into the BSB. And what I'm hoping to do here is potentially win this combat just through the static res. So I'm going to have a charge. I'm going to have a couple of ranks. So that's 3. I'm probably not going to do any damage. So I'm really hoping that this guy just flubs his attacks. I manage to win the combat and break him is what I'm really hoping for. I position 1 unit of archers to try to hopefully finish off that Chimera, which unfortunately they failed to do. My unit of archers that's in the area near the Treekin, I'm trying to get them out of the way so that they're not getting charged in subsequent turns by knights. And this unit that had been fleeing from the Shaggoth's earlier charge rallies and faces the Shaggoth to try to offer some support over there on my right flank. Going over to the Winds of Magic, I roll a 2 and a 1 for the Winds of Magic, but I get 2 channels. So here I am sitting on 5 dice to my opponent's 2. I am going to be targeting the unit of Marauders, which is also containing a Chaos Sorcerer, and I throw 5 dice at Dwellers Below. My opponent needs boxcars in order to dispel it. He fails to do so, and a bunch of those Marauders end up taking a dirt nap. The Treeman and the Chaos Chariot continue to tickle each other here in combat, and this combat between the two is going to continue into the next round. Treekin, just MVPs here, are taking minimal damage from this Hellfire Sword, and the Knights, again, not doing much damage, so it's sort of delaying the inevitable here to a certain extent, but couldn't ask for more from the Treekin, taking minimal damage and hanging around here. The Chaos Warriors end up charging my Great Eagle here. Now, because of the terrain, we're not actually able to easily put them in base-to-base contact. The Chimera decides to help out his buddy, the BSB, and charges the Dryad unit. This is scary, but that Chimera is only on 1 wound, so hey, anything could happen at this point. Small block of Chaos Warrior Bunker ends up charging the Treekin to help out the unit of Knights with the Chaos Lord. This is not ideal. They're getting reinforcements, but there are actually some guys that I might be able to kill, so kind of a mixed bag here, but that combat is becoming even larger than it was prior. Dragon Ogre Shaggoth charges my Great Eagle, and I've got my Wild Riders. Unfortunately, only 3 remaining in position to rear charge that Dragon Ogre Shaggoth in subsequent turns. So, unfortunately, sacrificing the Great Eagle here, which tends to be the case. Unfortunately, the Skull Crushers managed to maneuver their way out of being pinned behind that chariot, so a threat in future rounds. Chaos Warhounds tuck in behind the Chimera, and the Marauder bunker advances towards the flank of the Chaos Warriors to offer some support who are fighting the Treekin. Not surprisingly, here the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth squishes my Great Eagle and ends up overrunning. My Tree Man fighting the Chariot finally gets the job done here, freeing him up for subsequent rounds. The Dryads end up taking a bunch of casualties from the Chimera and the BSB, but they end up being steadfast and hold. And again, Lady Luck just smiling on the Treekin. The Treekin killing 2 knights and a Chaos Warrior. I do think I still lose this combat, but they make their check. I'm on the General's rerollable 10. I'm not steadfast at this point, but I lose by such a small margin that I'm able to hold around and really even starting to think maybe I can win that combat. Didn't expect that at all. The Eagle gets killed by the unit of Chaos Warriors, but they're forced to overrun because they're frenzied, and they get pinned in behind this cauldron of blood. During the top of turn 5, I like to charge the Marauder bunker with my dragon. My opponent chooses to flee, and he rolls a massive amount and ends up actually going all the way through that building he was in at the beginning of the game. I then decide that I'm going to redirect and help out these Treekin and charge the Chaos Warriors. My unit of archers towards my left flank ends up repositioning to start taking some pop shots at these warriors behind the cauldron of blood. My other archers get in position to fire at the skull crushers, but unfortunately all my great targets are either already dead or engaged in combat at this point. During my magic phase, I roll a 6 and a 2 for the Winds of Magic. No channels occur, and just tragically, I fail to cast Shield of Thorns with 2 dice on my level 4, which means my level 4 is done. Yeah, I rolled a 1 and a 3 on the 2 dice, and I elect then just out of desperation to throw 6 dice at Pit of Shades from my level 2 onto the Warhounds, really hoping that would deviate off and somehow hit the Chimera, was what my thought was, but that wasn't the case. I think killed a couple of Warhounds, but that wasn't really what I was going for here. My 3 Wild Riders do 4 wounds to the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, which is pretty good. I end up taking 2 wounds back, so I still got 1 guy there. But unfortunately, I don't break the Shaggoth, and he turns to face my last remaining Wild Rider. My Dragon on the Chaos Warriors just wreaks havoc on these guys. It is great. I kill 6 of these Chaos Warriors. I have a ton of static combat res. This is my opportunity really to really go over the top here and potentially start building up a victory. Unfortunately, although I win the combat by, I think, 3, my opponent makes all of his break tests, which the BSB is still nearby. So I was still, it's not outlandish that he would make them all. But, man, if I could have broken those units, that would have been game-changing. My Dryads do finally bounce from that combat, but I had sent the Tree Man in to help, so he's there hanging around, and the BSB elected not to pursue. During the bottom of turn 5, my opponent's Marauder bunker fails to rally, and they're just a hair away from getting off the board, which would have been just great. He's going to have one more opportunity at rallying, unfortunately, and that unit's actually worth a fair amount of points because my opponent's level 4 is in that unit. Chaos Warriors on the left flank do a swift reform to try to get back into the thick of things here. The Skull Crushers charge my Tree Man, and the War Shrine kind of maneuvers into the center of the battlefield. My opponent's magic options are pretty limited. One of his wizards is fleeing, the other is in combat, so he uses all of his 6 dice to try to cast the War Shrine's bound spell. And I use all my dice, and I dispel it. The Tree Man goes down to the Skull Crushers here, which is not terribly unexpected. They have to overrun because they're frenzied. And the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth polishes off that last Wild Rider, sadly. My Tree Man who's fighting the Chimera was charged by my opponent's BSB. Luckily here, my Tree Whack finally finishes off this guy, dead Chimera, but I am going to be tied up with this unkillable BSB. The Dragon polishes off the Chaos Warrior unit, but unfortunately the Treekin start to take substantially more damage. I end up holding, and I reform the Dragon to face the Shaggoth for a last turn charge. At the top of turn 6, I charge the Forest Dragon into the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth. Now, he's strength 7, which I kind of forgot, so this is a little risky. He's only got 2 wounds left, so if I can kill him, I'll get to strike first. That's the ideal scenario, but it is a little risky. The Dryads continue to flee through the unit of Chaos Warriors, and I position 2 units of archers to take some more shots at this block of Chaos Warriors. I'm not going to whittle them down in time here, but maybe kill just a few more for good measure. For my last magic phase, I end up rolling Snake Eyes. I throw 2 dice at Shield of Thorns on the dragon, figuring, hey, I'll get 2d6, strength 3 hits on the Shaggoth. Who knows, maybe I'll get 1 or 2 wounds through. Maybe that'll make the difference. My shooting does whittle down the Chaos Warrior unit to 16, but unfortunately it's not going to award me any victory points. Well, you can see my to wound roll here with the dragon. Unfortunately, I missed with all 5 attacks, and the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth ends up putting a couple more wounds on my dragon. The Chaos Lord ends up taking out the last of the Treekin and reforms to face the center. The BSB puts several wounds on my Tree Man. The Chaos Warriors declare a charge on my archers, which I flee. The warriors redirect in my other block of archers, who also elect to flee. My poor dryads, who are already fleeing, continue to flee from a long bomb charge from the Skull Crushers. Fortunately, they managed to stay on the board. And the Chaos Trolls continue to drool on themselves near my opponent's deployment zone. My opponent charges my general with his general, the Tree Man Ancient versus the Chaos Lord. Unfortunately, the Marauder block with the level 4 on the board's edge does rally in the bottom of turn 6. My opponent rolls a 6 and a 1 for the Winds of Magic. However, he only really has the War Shrine Bound spell. He throws 6 dice at it, and I managed to dispel it with my 6 dice. Again, my dragon just whiffs and gets put down by the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, tragically. On a positive note, my opponent's BSB fails to take out that Tree Man. And finally, going over to the combat between the Tree Man Ancient and the Chaos Lord. The Tree Man Ancient, unfortunately, was no match for that Hellfire Sword, so he goes down. This ends up being a solid victory for my opponent, losing the Tree Man Ancient, losing the dragon the last round. Not getting the spells that I was really hoping to use in this particular battle. These were things that I really couldn't overcome ultimately, but it was a great game. I had a blast. I think it came right down to the last couple of turns, which is always fun. And I want to thank my opponent for an awesome game. Hope you enjoyed this battle report. Looking forward to Warhammer the Old World here just in a couple of weeks. More to come on that. Bye for now.